Welcome to the Building Web3 podcast. Today, we dive deep into disrupting the $220 billion gaming market with Web3 games. We talk with Parallel Studios co-founder and learn how they got funding from one of YouTube's founders to kickstart their journey, and how they secured a game-changing partnership with the Amazon equivalent in Japan. Remember, nothing stated is financial advice. Welcome to the Building Web3 podcast. Today with my good friend Kohji here. He's the co-founder at Parallel Studios. Kohji, before we get too deep into Parallel Studios, could you give us a brief background into what you were doing before you entered the Web3 space?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's very multifaceted. I, at one point, was touring and playing music way back when. My education was in philosophy and political science, but my working career was mostly in software development. So, you jam all those things together and maybe that gets you Web3. I'm not sure. But a while ago, almost, I want to say like 8 years ago now or something along those lines, I started working at a startup with some friends of mine. And that startup actually had some crypto elements involved in it, and that's where we first learned of Ethereum and all this stuff. But it was like way outside my wheelhouse. I was actually doing what you're doing now, which is recording podcasts for them, and I kind of started a bit of a podcast network. The crypto thing sort of passed me by, but fast forward to the pandemic, and me and my buddies are all working from home. I'm still doing the software thing, and we kind of come together and say, hey, we have all this free time because we're stuck at home. We got nothing to do. Let's try and make a game. It's what we've always wanted to do. And at the same time, because we had that started previously, another friend of ours who's an artist was like, hey, and this is pre-Beeple, the NFT explosion. He's like, hey, some of my friends are getting into this NFT thing. Do you think it's a good idea? We did a little digging around and we're like, hold on. Rather than just sell your art, which is, completely valid thing to do, what if we smash these ideas together, we make a game, we incorporate the NFT bit of it, and see if we can get this whole thing going? And that's basically how Parallel started. But yeah, up until that point, I was essentially making software for lawyers.
And softwares for lawyers, obviously a very cool space. We'll talk a little bit about Parallel and its mission. Is it the mission to have like a Web3 gaming studio, or what is the overview of Parallel and its general mission?
Oh, I mean, I think it depends on who you ask at Parallel, but the two main points is we want to make games. We want to do the thing. We want to create the thing that we always wanted to play as a kid. That's how this whole thing started. So that's what we're going to do. But we also want to tell the stories that we have always wanted to tell. So this Sci-Fi thing is kind of one of the elements that brought me and this group of friends together, is talking about what the future might look like, and Star Wars and all the stuff that you would expect out of nerds like us. And we wanted to come up with our own version of what the future might be. And so not only do we want to make games in this I hate to use the term IP, but like in this universe that we've built, but we outside of the games, we'd love to tell the stories more. So we have things like comic books. In my wildest dreams, are we making like a cartoon or a movie or whatever? Yeah, look, absolutely.
So let's talk about some of the features. So we talked about, like sci-fi themed trading cards. Can you talk a little bit about the games you guys currently have and what are kind of the general features there? So paint a picture for the audience as to like what they get from something like Parallel Studio games.
Yeah, so our main offering is Parallel, the card game, the Parallel TCG. So if you've ever played something like Magic or Hearthstone or Runeterra, then you're probably familiar with the genre. This is our twist on it. It, as you mentioned, is sci-fi based. I won't go into the whole story of the parallels, but it is, we try and keep it less fantastical, more plausible reality. Now, obviously, elements of it border onto the fantastical, but the idea is like, could something like this happen in the future? Maybe. And the game itself, you collect cards and make a deck prior to entering into a match, and then in a match, it's a one-on-one card game where you're trying to destroy your opponent before your opponent destroys you by playing cards that do things like summon units for your armies, or you can launch effects at them and play relics and that sort of thing. And that's one game. And then the other game that we're working on that isn't quite available to play just yet is a game called Colony, which is Colony is kind of like a sim survival type game. However, the twist is that you're not the one controlling the player. The player is actually an AI that you're paired with. And what you do as the human is sort of help guide them through the space. So you're like the super ego or the angel or devil on their shoulder saying like, hey, maybe you should, try mining and build this thing. Or, I really think that in order to gain influence in the colony, maybe you should go to the bar and start professing how you could do things better or whatever. You're kind of like explaining to them how to navigate this world, but they have their own free will. So depending on how what sort of relationship you build with this AI, they'll be more or less likely to follow your orders or suggestions to the word. And even then, they're probably not going to go against their human nature, or AI nature, I suppose. But yeah, that in a nutshell is Colony.
Now there are definitely a few interesting components that were listed there. So we talked about like NFTs. There's this whole huge storyline. There's AI involved. You were coming from the building technology from lawyer space. It must have been very challenging to make this switch and then make these highly complex games. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you had switching into Web3 and kind of how you overcame them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the game part wasn't so much a challenge to me because I've always been a bit of we'll say amateur game designer. I've always actually wanted to make board games and card games, like physical games in the physical space. The biggest challenges I had in the Web3 world were learning how to navigate the Web3 world, honestly, and realizing that when designing games and systems in this space, I like to view it as there's sort of three types of players, collectors, whatever you want to call them, that sort of overlap in a Venn diagram. In one circle you have the hardcore gamer that's just like, I want a fun game, and let's play. And who cares about the assets? Who cares about whatever? Just give me a good game. And then in another Venn diagram, you have the collectors, who are the guys who, in Magic the Gathering want to own the Black Lotuses and the, all the Power 9 cards and whatever, because it's like, oh, this is a rare thing, and that's interesting to me. And then in another circle, you have the sort of financially driven, let's call them speculators or whatever, and they need to be catered to as well, because it is part of the Web3 space. And I think sort of denying that or poo-pooing that is probably not going to serve you well. And that sort of was definitely a challenge to me. But then realizing, okay, there are these three somewhat separate groups. So of course, people can belong to some or all of those groups, but how do you make something that appeals to all of those groups while not sort of disrupting the game space, right? Because it's very easy to cater to collectors and speculators, but then your game may become too expensive to play or pay to win or what have you. If you just cater to the game element, you may not capture the sort of crypto zeitgeist, and then you're in trouble on that end. And so, finding the happy middle ground there and navigating that space, I think, has been the biggest challenge.
Definitely. So not as much the technical challenge, but more the like keeping different counterparties relatively satisfied with the gameplay and the experience.
Yeah. And sort of making sure that when you have systems in mind that you're not too focused in one area or the other, because it becomes like immediately obvious to the other people when your sole focus is in one and not the others. Like if you're like, okay, I'm going to make the super rare asset one of one, whatever, the players are going to be like, well, this is bullshit. This is just like them trying to sort of cater to the whatever OpenSea Magic Eden buyers, as opposed to like, this is healthy for the game. And of course, if you mint 500 million of a given asset, and then you're like, everyone should buy this asset, the crypto guys are going to be like, well, this doesn't make any sense either. So you kind of have to juggle that.
Now, gaming has been kind of a big narrative earlier in the bull market, and kind of people were saying like, well, does the game have to be like particularly fun? Like, how do you kind of go about marketing this game? Is it like, hey, we start with fun first, like interesting gameplay first, and then like crypto and like price appreciation, these things are like secondary? How do you guys kind of approach that? I would say almost marketing or like strategic positioning.
Yeah, I mean, from a design perspective, it has to be game first. I think if you do it any other way, you're making a huge mistake, because at the end of the day, and I guess it depends on how you position yourself, but at the end of the day, if you are telling people you are a games company and that you are making games, then it has to be about the games, and none of the other assets necessarily should be coming first, because that doesn't make any sense. You know, if you're like a proper game studio, your product at the end of the day is the games. And of course, like you can point to a whole bunch of other games like Counter-Strike and Fortnite or whatever. They have skins, and there's a big market for all of that stuff, and that matters. But the reason why that stuff matters is because there's a bunch of players playing that game because it's a good game, and they want to sort of flex on the other players. That's why they want those cosmetics. That's why they want those rare items. That's why they want X, Y, Z, is because they're in the game obsessed with the loop. It's not just because they want the expensive loot and they're like, oh, what is this game? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So I think you have to start with a fun game. You have to sort of capture gamers' interest. And the more interest you have in your game, the more players you have in your game, the rarer those assets become. And by that, I mean, okay, let's just say that you have a 1 of 500. Let's say there's like an asset that has 500 copies of it. In a game where there's only 500 players, that's not a very rare asset. In a game where there's 5 million players, that's an insanely rare asset. So you kind of have to realize like the only way to get the rarity or the price appreciation or whatever that those other groups want is to focus on the gameplay to start with.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the adoption of Web3 games, because it seems like people could come from like maybe the Counter-Strike, the Call of Duty space, and they're like, I mean, we've been doing just fine without blockchain. Like, what is really the bull case for like why even build games on the blockchain?
I mean, that's a pretty tough question. There's a few answers. Now, I say it's tough not because I don't have an answer. I definitely have some answers, but it's tough because my first answer is I don't think we know the absolute bull case. Like, it's pretty easy, low-hanging fruit to say, okay, you can own your assets, you can do whatever, and I'll make a case for that for sure, because I actually do think it's important. But I think the real bull case is when somebody really figures out how to use this technology in a new and novel way that blows people's heads off. That's when we'll start to realize like, oh shit, I didn't realize this is what I wanted. So you think about Amazon, right? Amazon's a great example of something that's like absolutely ubiquitous. When people are looking for products, they search for it on Amazon. But a lot of people forget, like, they started off only selling books, and you look at it and you're like, well, why does anyone need an online bookstore? What's the point of this? But then they realize like, wait, there's more to this, right? And so I think like the asset ownership is the online bookstore of the functionality that we need in Web3 right now. But I will say that people were buying books from Amazon before it went into this like we sell everything model. And so to move over to that, as a card game player specifically, and this is one of the reasons we made it a card game, Parallel, our first offering, was I loved going into the card store as a kid, looking in the glass cases and being like, I want that Black Lotus, I want that whatever. And people were making, and still are making, living selling those cards, right? And I think that when you have an open market that isn't controlled by the company that created the asset, which is what Wizards has done with their paper game, they don't ever sell singles of cards, and we would never do that as Parallel. Now we just sell packs of cards, and the idea is that like if you want to build a deck with the cards that have already been sold, you have to buy them on secondary, or the users have to generate new copies of them, right? So, and even then, so then you're buying it on a marketplace. And so to me, it's important because it allows people to have control. They're, separate from us over what they feel these cards are worth, how they should be traded. People could make their digital version of that Magic the Gathering card store and potentially make a living selling parallel cards. And I think that is super important, because as soon as a company sort of has their stranglehold over how and when those assets can be transacted, it becomes a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit muddy in my eyes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I often go back and forth, but I do think overall it will be better for the industry. Are you seeing more Web3 gaming studios pop up? And were you guys kind of one of the first people to do it? I feel like I've only recently been hearing about this narrative in the last year, 6 months, where it really got popular.
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing it for years, and there have been studios that have come and gone, and so a bunch that have stuck around, and that, it goes in waves, right? I think that obviously when the zeitgeist is with crypto, there are more studios, and especially when it's with Web3 gaming, there are more studios. And then you kind of have to weather the storm until that comes back around and more pop up. But it's hard to say. I think that every day there are better and better products in the space. When we started, people, ourselves included, were selling a dream. It was like, here's a paper about the game we want to make, and you couldn't jump in and start playing it. And now the bar has been pushed that much higher. It's like, okay, give me a playable demo, and then we can talk about what your game is like. And almost every game now that exists in the space will have a demo. People aren't just buying on speculation alone. And I think pretty soon, once those demos become cream of the crop, then it's like, okay, now I need a full game, or so an absolutely sick playable slice. And so the bars keeps getting higher. And does that mean that it's going to be harder for people to make games? I just think that the games are going to have to be better. And so maybe we might see less studios over time. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm just speculating, honestly.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, because to me, it's very curious. I don't know much about the gaming space, more on the AI, DeFi area, even some of the social fi. Let's talk a little bit about the fundraising process for a parallel studio. Do you guys go out to investors and you're like, hey, I'm going to build this game, and then you're seeking funds, and then you're, I guess, generating revenue from either game sales or in-game purchases? How does essentially the funding work for a gaming studio in the Web3 world?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of the above. When we started, part of our origin story was that we messaged. I hate telling this story because I feel like he's gonna get an influx of messages now. But we messaged on Twitter, a cold message to Chad Hurley, who's the founder of YouTube, and we said, "Hey, we have this crazy idea for a game. You got to check it out. It's gonna be massive or whatever." And he was like, "Okay, let's set up a call." We didn't know him, we didn't whatever, and we jumped on a call with him. And by the end of it, he was like, "You know what, boys, I'm in." And so that kind of started us off on our journey. And having his name attached added an air of credibility to what we were doing that allowed us to get in the door of some other investors. But in the meantime, back when we started, people were minting NFTs. They were essentially just sending ETH to a contract, and maybe there was a web portal for that, and then getting NFTs back in their wallet, but nothing else was happening. And we had the idea of okay, well, we're making a game, and people can't play the game yet, so we need to inject elements of fun into this. And so what we did is we created a pack opening experience for the NFTs that you got. And come here. You want to say hi?
Hi.
Okay, Papa's got a... Oh.
I got a little doll.
Yeah, you got a little doll. Okay, Papa's got to talk now, okay?
And for the listeners, we fortunately were able to see Kohji. What would you say? Your daughter?
My daughter, yeah.
Gave us a brief shout out. She's very into Web3 gaming studios at a very young age. It's quite interesting.
Her doll's actually an NFT. Okay, so what we did was we turned the acquisition of those NFTs into a pack opening experience. So you didn't just send ETH to an address and then get NFTs back into your wallet. What you did was you sent us the ETH, and we had a whole website set up, and we said we had a countdown on that website. Come back at this time. You come back, and a video would play, and you would get to like open your packs and turn over the cards one at a time to see what was in those packs. And that experience kind of really brought people in, and we were selling those packs for a nominal amount of ETH, and we were able to mint out almost every single time that we did a pack sale because of those experiences. So we were able to raise money from users that way as well. And now that the game is live, we obviously have in-app purchases and battle passes and all the other stuff. And so it's a mix of investor funds and...
So people were buying, so just so I have this completely straight, is people were buying the cards as like a collectible essentially. And then it was with the future promise of like, hey, there's going to be an underlying gameplay behind this NFT card.
Oh yeah, the gameplay was already outlined. So originally, the way the game studio was founded, we originally put out some of the art that we created, and it was actually 15 pieces of art. And we said, look, here's the art, here's the overview for the game. Like some general design. If we make enough money on the sale, we will make the game. And this is the only time we ever sold individual cards because we had no notion at packs or whatever. And we made just enough money to pay 3 artists for a year. And none of the other founders, there's 6 of us, one of whom is an artist, took any funds or anything. We just hired those 3 people and said, let's just keep it going. And we told people at the time, if we didn't make enough money, that we would just refund and they could keep the NFTs or whatever. And so by the time the pack opening experiences rolled around, there was a good deal of explanation on what the game would be and how it would be played and et cetera. And so I think people, again, were buying cards for the promise of being able to play them in this game.
Absolutely. And I think a really interesting point about this story is essentially the fundraising aspect. Because when I talk to many founders, they'll list, I'd say, 3 primary issues that they have. It's 1 is marketing, 2 fundraising, and then sometimes community engagement if they've already launched a token and just trying to keep the community especially engaged even through bear cycles. So the fundraising largely through cold DM. Were you sending out a lot of cold DMs? Were you guys like sending cold emails or just this?
No. So our awareness, the awareness of our project, was mainly done through shit posting on Twitter. Like we didn't spend a single dollar on marketing. We just kind of like became friendly with people on Twitter and like would make jokes and whatever. And because of our startup past that I mentioned in the beginning, we had some idea of how fundraising was traditionally done, and so we were making inroads there. But one of the things that we wanted to do first was make sure that we had shown promise in these pack sales and, that the appetite was there and what have you. So we actually got the community money before we did any of the fundraising bits. But yeah, I mean, the cold message was more out of like cowboy bravado or whatever than it was like a strategy.
Yeah, I always say, and I'm sure I've stole this from somebody, is that the money's kind of made in the follow up. So like, guys, if you're out there sending a bunch of cold DMs trying to raise money or trying to like get people to work for you, keep going. It can work eventually. So, and then the marketing was largely based off the shit posting, and shit posting, for anyone unfamiliar, I'm sure everyone is, but it's essentially like memes and like just messing around on Twitter/X and just having a good time. And then community. Sorry, you were about to say something.
No, I was like, yeah, I think especially in Web3, it's all about being present and presenting yourself and just acting like a human being. And one of the things that a lot of people in this space like to do as human beings is talk shit with one another. And I think that helped us a lot.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a weird combination of it's like people are desiring human beings, but then there's the giant PFP culture where you're like, who am I talking to? This like weird picture of a penguin. And it's a very interesting space. Web3, there's so many peculiarities that are tough to explain to the normie. But yeah, I would say similar to what you were talking about before, from switching from the lawyer software into Web3, like some of the Web3 stuff that's the most tricky is just being in the space and like the peculiar sense of humor as well. I love it, but it takes some getting used to, I'd say.
Oh yeah, there's some acclimatizing to it, and I mean, with any sort of like humor driven personalities or what have you, there's some people that I think maybe take it a little bit too far. That
Mm.
uh, it's not really for me, but it's one of those things where it's like, if you want to operate in this space, you have to be prepared for people who don't take it all that seriously while taking it insanely seriously. It's a very hard thing to sort of wrap your head around, which is, I think, very tough for newcomers.
Yeah, I remember coming to this when I started getting more into marketing, and I'd always back in the day be like, why do reggaeton artists and like rap artists and like rock stars all wear such peculiar clothing? Like they're never just dressed like a normal person. And you're like, oh, it's all marketing. It's all just like get more attention, wear the weirdest sunglasses possible, like put spikes on your clothing, like get more attention. I'm sure it's the same, and this is why you see on like social media, like people push it to the extremes because often there's very little ramifications, and then there's like pretty high upside if you're willing to compromise on that. So, can you talk about some of the notable partnerships or collaborations Parallel's formed in building the game, and how that's kind of brought like value to your platform?
Oh man, well, I think I'll mention the biggest one to date, and is our most recent mention as well, is that we have a partnership with Rakuten in Japan to distribute physical cards and toys and comics in Japan. And whenever you buy, say, like Magic the Gathering, or you buy another manga or whatever, they'll stick some of our stuff in there so that that side of the world can get a taste. And it's like super exciting for us because they're basically like the Amazon of Japan. And it's entry into a market that we aren't super present in right now, but it's also goes back to what we were talking about before, because it's the toys, it's the comics, it's the physical cards. It's not, I mean, obviously those things will lead people to the game, but it allows us to branch out into things that are more than just like, here's a digital card game. Like the idea of like, maybe we can, I don't know, make a movie or or a cartoon or a TV show or whatever, is like becomes more real when you start to like branch into physical space, or at least that's how it feels to me. So that's like the one that I'm like most excited about right now.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I remember hearing about Pudgy Penguins getting in Walmart, and I was like, "Whoa, Web3 to retail? This is crazy!" And it seems like you guys have also crossed that divide, and you're probably the only company I've heard, aside from like RWA companies, that RWA standing for real world assets, that are doing this like Web3 to retail, Web3 to regular users. So let's talk about some of the like, are there any kind of like milestones or developments you want to talk about, like any new exciting features that the community can be on the lookout for?
Oh, it's hard for me to keep track just because we have a million things up in the air. But I will say that, like, you know, we've added automated tournaments to the game, which essentially just means at certain times in the day you can go and jump into a larger tournament against live players and potentially get a whole bunch of stuff, win a whole bunch of stuff. But then there's like more high stakes versions of that you can use. Eventually, we're going to turn on prime tournaments, or and what that will allow you to do is use our ERC20, which is called Prime, to enter into these tournaments and win larger prize pools and all this stuff. So I think it's you know, that sort of stuff is really fun for me, because I love I in a past life played some semi-competitive Magic, and I love going to the card store and facing off against strangers to see like how was I really when the pressure was on. It's one thing to like sort of grind at the ladder, but it's another thing when people are bringing decks to tournaments that like who knows what they're going to sit down with. And anyway, so that's something that I'm super excited for. We're also in a process right now where we're hyper focused on improving the stability and UI UX of our current clients. So I'm pretty excited about some of the explorations that we're doing on that end. We have some new and interesting fun animations and interactions that I'm pushing really hard to get into the client. It'll make it feel more alive in my mind.
Yeah, that seems really exciting. And I just have a question about card games and like going to so people bring their own decks. I assume they have to shuffle them. Like, how does that work? Sorry, this is very unrelated to Web3, but I've never been to one of these.
So generally speaking, you register ahead of time. You give them a list of cards that you're going to be playing with, and most of the time you have to own them, unless it's like a type of tournament in which the cards are super, super rare. Then what you would do in a non-digital game is you could buy a proxy, which is just like a fake copy of that card, and put it in there, just because some of them are too rare for people to own, or they don't want to play with because they're too expensive or whatever. But you register your deck beforehand, and then you sit down or several decks sometimes, depending on the tournament, and then you face off against other players. And some of them have varying rules, like best 2 out of 3 and whatever, but a bracket format for the most part, and the last man standing gets the riches.
Hey, very cool. And if anyone wants to connect with Parallel and see what you guys have on the horizon, there seems to be a bunch of cool developments. Clearly, like, they can buy the cards if they live in Japan. Where can they go to connect with you guys, learn more about the project, connect with you online as well?
Yeah, so very active on our Discord. So if you want to get the most updated information and interact with some of the top players, some of the team members, etc., Discord is definitely the place to go. The main Twitter for the account is at Parallel TCG, and we essentially iterate out in the open, so you can see almost everything that we're doing in real time on that Twitter account. And then the main website for the game is parallel.life.
Very exciting. Well, I'll put all the links in the description. Everyone go join the Discord. Please get involved. And I think this was a great episode on learning how to build, Web3 games and understanding a little bit about like gameplay and strategy and the fundraising space. So everyone go out there and build something cool in Web3. Kohji, thank you so much for joining.